Okay, hi everybody, this is Professor Kauser, putting together a video lecture for you just to give some background to the 19th and early 20th century lead up to the Second World War. I think it'll be helpful. I was taking a look again at the short history book that you read and that you'll be commenting on starting tonight, and I thought a little bit longer term background might be somewhat useful, especially thinking in terms of ideology, the ideologies that shaped Europe through the 19th century and set up the situation for the 20th century. So, what is an ideology? When we talk about an ideology, we are talking about a kind of a political philosophy or a kind of a culture or attitude. An ideology has two parts. It has a description of the way the person expressing the ideology believes the world actually is, that is to say, a kind of a statement of fact, an understanding about the nature of the world or of society, and then uses that understanding of the nature of reality to justify a course of political action or to give legitimacy to a political system, right? So the theory of the nature of the world or the nature of society acts as a justification for saying, therefore, we ought to have this kind of government, and if we don't have this kind of government already, we ought to make changes, make reforms or revolution until we get it. The 19th century had been a great age for ideology. Intellectuals, philosophers, students, activists, reformers of all kinds were very eagerly sort of developing ideological ideas and trying to alter society and reform it on the basis of them. And there were three ideologies in particular, three sort of features of the political landscape, which very much created the conditions that led to World War II. One of them was nationalism, another one was communism, and the third one was imperialism, and they all kind of wove together in different ways. So let me talk about each of them. Nationalism is a political ideology based on the concept of the nation. There had been, of course, kingdoms and republics and different kinds of political powers for a long time. People had used the term nation beforehand, but in the 19th century you really got a new concept of the nation crystallizing together different older ideas and sort of bringing them together into one big whole package. The idea to a nation is that you bring together several different components. A nation has, first of all, territory, a defined space of land with a border around it, right? You can define a nation by drawing its borders on a map. That territory, of course, then also has to have population, which was the main thing that used to be meant by the word nation, a group of people who occupy that defined territory, and those people share a culture. Right, so third component after territory and population, you have to have a sense of shared culture across the population. That culture can take many different forms. It can involve lots of different things, family life, the foods they eat, all that kind of a thing. But then also, kind of a fourth element or part of the third element, language would also become a common thing, right? The shared language of the people defines them as having a common culture and therefore being a nation together that ought to live in this defined territory. And then finally, depending on your counting, the fourth or fifth thing, depending on whether you count language as separate or part of culture, but the final component is an independent sovereign government. That is to say, all the people with a shared culture living in a fixed territory ought to have their own government. They ought to be self-governing, and they ought to be united under a single government, right? So wherever you can identify a people, a nation, they should not be under somebody else's rule. They ought to be independent and have rule of themselves, and they shouldn't be broken up into multiple, different republics or kingdoms or whatnot. They all ought to be united together. So this is the idea of nationalism. Very powerful idea, right? All this territory belongs together. All these people belong together. They all have one united culture, and they all ought to be under one sovereign government together. Now, this required a lot of changes to the older order that had been inherited out of the 18th century and earlier. Before that, most lands had been kingdoms, and their ideology had been the sovereign power of the dynasty, usually kind of absolute monarchy, where the basis of the government's legitimacy didn't come from the people, it came from the legitimacy of the dynasty. The ruling house had always ruled these people. Didn't much matter what culture, what ethnicity people were. It didn't even matter if you had a patchwork of territories, or maybe scattered islands of territories, separated off from the main block of land that a king ruled. The king ruled those lands by hereditary right and by divine right, and so you might have different ethnic groups, you might have different languages, you might have different patches of territory. It didn't matter, they all belonged to the king. So nationalism really changed that a lot, right? Sort of said that where you've got different ethnicities, each of them ought to have their own nation. Where you have one government ruling everything, everybody under its rule ought to be one nation. And the legitimacy of the government ought to come not from the dynasty and its heredity, but rather ought to come from the people being ruled, right? Their being a nation was what created legitimacy. This was the basis of the American Revolution, right, to some extent. Certainly a basis of the French Revolution. The idea of the French people are the basis of the state, not the Bourbon dynasty. And so it sort of created this revolutionary nationalistic impulse to redraw the map, reinvent government on the basis of nationalistic ideas. So a very powerful idea. Did a great deal to reform and change governments in the end of the 18th and getting into the 19th century. Gave impulse to a lot of revolutionary movements. We tend to think of nationalism as conservative, but in some ways, compared to the older ideology of monarchies, it was actually revolutionary and reforming of an idea. And also very powerful for mobilizing people, right? Everybody belongs to the nation. The sense of belonging to a nation, being a citizen of the nation or a member of the nation, not just a subject of the king, gave people a strong emotional attachment to their countries, a strong political adherence to the actions of their government, sort of a sense that they're participants and it belongs to them, rather than just the king in some faraway palace is doing what he wants and it doesn't have anything to do with me, right? So nationalism, very powerful idea spreading. There's a couple of other things about nationalism which are important. One is that nationalism turns minorities into a problem. Right? If you have an ethnic group or people speaking a different language under the rule of government within the territory of the dominant group, it raises the question, what do you do with them? Right? Are they allowed to keep their separate identity? Are they allowed to keep speaking their separate languages and dialects? Or should they be somehow assimilated into the nation and made to fit in with the dominant national identity? Or perhaps should they be expelled or persecuted or somehow gotten rid of? And that would also be a major question in the 19th century and into the 20th. What do you do with minorities? What do you do with immigrants? What do you do with groups like gypsies and Jews and people like that who are not necessarily easy to conform to the dominant national identity? So that's one factor. It also, by the way, means central governments can become much more powerful, much more intrusive in daily life. If you look at a place like France at the beginning of the 1800s, you had lots of different dialects kind of related to each other, but people up north in Normandy spoke a very different kind of language than people down the south in Provence. Norman French, very different from Provençal French. So one of the things that nationalism will give rise to is an attempt to create a standardized national language, school systems, especially rising public school systems that are going to educate young people to all speak correct French or correct English, the way it's spoken at the capital, the way that it's spoken by the government. And this is all part of this process of assimilating people to belong to one big unified nation, right? Nationalism gives rise to the sense that that's very important to do. The other thing, finally, is what about places where you don't have a united sovereign government? This can raise problems in a couple of different ways. If you look at Central Europe in the 1800s, 19th century, if you look at a place like Germany or Italy, these are areas where you have a sense of shared culture to some extent, people speaking different versions of the German language, different dialects of German, different dialects of Italian, some sense of shared culture, more so sort of educated elites feeling they have a shared culture, not so much, farmers on the ground in their villages, but certainly the educated and leading classes feeling like they're all one big German people or one big Italian people, but those lands were divided up into many small republics and principalities and different kinds of patchworks of territory. In the 1800s, nationalism gives rise to the sense that we ought to all unite this. We ought to create some kind of a big common government to unite all the German people, all the Italian people, and bring them together. And so you get movements to do this, and a certain number of wars and diplomatic negotiations and different measures going along. And then finally, the two countries do unite, Germany in 1871, Italy in 1878. And this really means big shifts in Europe's politics, because all of a sudden, in these areas, very large areas of Central Europe, where you used to have all these little patchworks of small territories that were not very powerful and could be interfered with easily by, France or England or other outside groups. Now all of a sudden you have these very large, powerful nations coming together and wanting to kind of consolidate themselves and stake out their territory on the map. When you look into Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, you get a different kind of a situation where nationalism is going to have an effect. There you get things like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Ottoman Empire based down on Turkey, or the Russian Empire. Old-style dynastic monarchies ruling multi-ethnic groups of subjects, right? Even in the name Austro-Hungarian Empire, you can hear that. You've got Austrians, you've got Hungarians, besides them you've got Czechs and Moravians and Slovenes and Croatians and Serbs and all these other ethnic groups going around in this, big hodgepodge of an empire. The Turks and the Russians had similar situations. And as nationalistic ideas start creeping in there, the groups of subjects are too different to hope to create one big common national identity out of all of them. So instead what you get are independence movements, right? The Czechs, the Croats, the Serbs, the Sorbs, all these different groups start wanting to have their own separate nations, and you get these sort of revolutionary movements wanting to break away from the bigger empire, and that causes lots of anxiety, lots of conflict coming about as a result of that. So Eastern Europe getting very much unstable over the 19th century as nationalism spreads there, even as Central Europe is kind of pulling together and uniting. Okay, so nationalism is one thing, and one thing that should help us bear in mind when you look at the Axis powers in World War II, the two main European ones, Germany and Italy, remember, were relatively new nations. They had, only become United Nations a generation before the First World War, a couple generations before the Second World War, right? Only in the 1870s had those appeared on the map as new nations in place of the older, tinier principalities that had existed beforehand. Okay, so nationalism, one very major ideology, still very strong in the 20th century. Second ideology, communism, and socialism more broadly, but particularly communism we'll look at here. Revolutionary ideology, communism was a response to the revolutionary movements of the 19th century, going back to the French Revolution. A lot of these ideologies and political philosophies started thinking more, not just how do you justify the existing political order, or how do you tinker with it and, improve it or update it, but maybe how should it be reinvented from the beginning, right? Sort of truly radical ideas about completely changing society towards more idealistic lines. Communism was initially theorized, of course, by the philosopher Karl Marx, with his associate Friedrich Engels. Marx and Engels and other communists developed the theory going forward. And their central principle was that economics are the main engine driving society. Not ideas, not philosophy, not morals or religion or anything like that. They thought that the main force that drives society is economics, and the real power in history, driving history, creating the order that you look at in the world, was an economic order in which people tried to control what they call the means of production. That is to say, the sources of wealth in a society. As technology and economic development changes the means of production, the structure of society is going to change to match it. So they believed that back in ancient history, you had a society basically agricultural, built around slaves and masters, right? The masters own the slaves, force the slaves to work for them, and that's how you generate wealth. That's how you're productive for this upper class of slave owners to exploit the labor of a subjugated lower class of slaves. Then they believed the Roman Empire breaks up. You have a sort of a social revolution, which leads to what they called feudalism. And their notion of feudalism was this was a society where instead of slaves owned by masters, you had a society of peasants or serfs who were controlled by lords. They weren't exactly the property of the lords, not slaves, but a new sort of a legal system in which the lords were able to, again, exploit the labor of the peasants in order to produce wealth for themselves and control the means of production, still basically agricultural land in that way. What they thought was happening in their own time, and had kind of begun with the French revolutions, was a new order based around the rise of industry and the rise of the factory. The old agricultural order of lords and peasants had fallen apart and was being replaced by a new order where the two main classes were the bourgeoisie on the one hand and the proletariat on the other. The bourgeoisie were the owners of the factories, right? They were the capitalists, the ones who owned the means of production, which were now not fields of grain, but were rather factories and machinery in the factories for producing goods. And this was the major engine of wealth. The proletariat, on the other hand, were their employees, the workers in the factories being paid a wage, who had become dependent on the factory owners for their means of subsistence, right? In the old days, a peasant could have his farm and kind of be self-sustaining and grow his own food. He had a certain kind of independence, even though they were dominated by feudal lords. But in the new order, the worker doesn't own his own means of subsistence. He doesn't have access to his own, way of producing food. He's dependent on the wages paid to him by the bourgeoisie in order to be able to buy food and the other things that are necessary for survival. And just as the master-slave relationship had been exploitive, just as the lord and peasant relationship had been exploitive, the bourgeoisie-proletariat relationship was again exploitive, and Marx believed that a new revolution was coming and should come, in which the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie, and this time the revolution would be once and for all. Instead of a new dominant class and exploited class emerging, instead you would have a class-less society in which there was no private property, in which everything would be owned by the community collectively, and therefore in which everybody would be treated equally and would have equal wealth, and you would have no more exploitation, right? So that's kind of the communist idea. You had communist cells and groups and kind of movements and newspapers and things circulating all through the 19th century, but had never really succeeded at changing a government or overthrowing a government in the course of the 19th century, until we get to World War I, which we'll get to in just a moment. Okay, third ideology is imperialism, which kind of exists alongside of, particularly nationalism. And here what was going on was, it's kind of an extension of nationalism in some ways. An extension, but also kind of a contradiction to it in some ways. Imperialism was a practice or an ideology in which nations opportunistically sought to build empires wherever they could, to send their armed forces abroad, to create networks of trade where their navies and armies would enforce favorable trade conditions and treaties on distant lands, or they would actually occupy distant lands, potentially colonize them, send their own people abroad to live there, govern them, and create these global networks which would sort of feed wealth and feed resources back to the mother country in these great imperial networks. And from around 1800 or so, you had, of course, earlier colonial empires directed mainly at the Americas, with the British colonies in North America, and the French in Quebec, and the Spanish all over Latin America. The generation around 1800 had largely caused those to be lost to the European powers, right? The American Revolution. There were Latin American revolutions around the same time. There was a Haitian Revolution against France. European countries had mostly lost their North and South American empires around 1800, between 1776 and about 1820, 1830 or so. But then you saw a turn to the east, where you got new European empires getting built in places like India, Indonesia, taken over by the Dutch. Africa starts getting carved up by various European powers, especially at the end of the 1800s, the 1880s, 1890s. You get the scramble for Africa. Different parts of Asia you get people moving into. So it's imperialism where the British, most of all, the French not too far behind, building these massive global empires, and other smaller countries like Portugal, the Netherlands, a couple of others, the Danes to some extent, the Americans getting into it very late, also trying to grab overseas possessions to build up these overseas empires, all for their profit. As far as how that sets up World War II, these empires, first of all, are still in place, and if anything, they're bigger than ever. At the dawn of World War II, the British and French Empire is quite massive, the Dutch also. There's American possessions abroad in places like the Philippines. Also, the late arriving nations that we spoke about, places like Germany and Italy, very late to the party. You know, England and France had been building up their overseas empires for generations by the time Germany unites or by the time Italy unites. And so when Germany and Italy unite, they try to pick up some overseas territories. They get some. They get Libya. Germans get Namibia down in Africa. There's a couple of corners here, but there's sort of sense that they've had to settle for the leftovers, and most of it's already been carved up by the older nations like England and France. And that's something which, in the sense of competition among nations and everybody wanting to assert themselves on the global stage, is resented by the new coming arrivals. Finally, the other thing about imperialism that's relevant here is the emergence of Japan. Japan, for centuries, had kept itself isolated from global trade. It closed its ports after having some contact with Europeans and was not allowing much trade with Europe at all. In 1850, what is it, 1853, I believe, or 54, an American fleet under Commodore Perry had sailed into Tokyo Harbor, and it pretty much forced the Japanese at gunpoint to open themselves up to foreign trade. This led to a major shakeup in Japanese society, led to the downfall of the shoguns who had ruled Japan up to that point. There was a period of uncertainty and chaos in Japan, followed by the rise of what's called the Meiji regime. And the Meiji had basically called for a policy of deliberate maximum modernization and westernization, starting about 1870 or so. Notice, by the way, about the same time as Germany and Italy are uniting, the Meiji are calling for Japan to catch up with the West, modernize, industrialize, militarize, build an empire of its own, and sort of follow this very ambitious, very aggressive policy so that they wouldn't be humiliated the way they had been in 1854, so they could get to the point that they can stand toe-to-toe with these European powers that had kind of come in, swept in and dominated them. So that's a big part of the Japanese background. It's going to lead the Japanese to starting to grab Pacific Islands when they could. They would seize possession of Korea, of Taiwan, places like that. In the 1930s, it got the Japanese into a war with China as they're trying to expand their power in China there. Okay, so that's the 19th century background of these ideologies: nationalism, communism, and imperialism. And these all come to a head with World War I between 1914 and 1918, in which the imperialism and nationalism of European countries leads them into this massive European war, with some sideshows going on in other parts of the world. World War I still fundamentally a European war, as the different countries are trying to sort of assert themselves. World War I, we're not going to go into any detail about World War I, but just a couple of things to think about it in this respect. One is that World War I really proves to be a test of economies more than anything else. It's an extremely industrialized war. People using railroads, using factories to produce guns and ammunition and things like that on a scale that had never been seen before. Using the mechanisms of modern management and modern bureaucracy and the nationalistic ideology to draft and recruit and train and send into the field larger armies, by the millions than had ever seen before, in the new technology of poison gas, chemical industry making that possible, more powerful explosives, machine guns to kill off those soldiers in numbers that had never been seen before. At the Battle of the Somme in 1915, the British lost 15,000 soldiers in one day, right? That's an enormous, enormous number. So it's massive, massive, massive conflict using all this modern things. And in this situation, it's very difficult to win decisive victories. Soldiers are being slaughtered everywhere without anybody really making much progress. The war ends up being won in terms of which country's economy is able to sustain the war effort longer. Right, sort of this is putting an enormous strain on life back home. How long can you keep up the political will to keep fighting when people are dying by thousands and thousands and thousands, when the economies are getting so heavily disrupted? The Russians are the first to crack, right? German armies don't get to Moscow or St. Petersburg or any of the really sort of core Russian cities. They're basically fighting in what's now Poland, had been part of the Russian Empire back then. But the Russians just can't keep up the pace of continuing to produce weapons for the field, of continuing to put men in the field. You wind up with a Russian Revolution breaking out in 1917, which overthrows the monarchy, the government of the Tsars, and the revolution itself rapidly gets taken hold of by a highly organized communist organization, the Bolsheviks, who then reinvent the old Russian Empire into a Soviet Union, a communist state. So it's the first time you've had the communist ideology not just be an idea in workers' groups and intellectual circles, but actually take charge of a government and try to reinvent a country along communist ideology. This terrifies everybody, all the other nations. In fact, one thing that people often forget, even while World War I was still being fought in France and elsewhere, in 1917, 1918, and certainly once the war stops there and you get into 1919, 1920, you have the Russians in 1917, the communists sign a peace treaty, drop out of World War I fighting Germany. They've got a civil war going on in Russia with the Bolsheviks on one side being the Reds, the Red Army, and all the anti-Bolsheviks, monarchists, people wanting democracy, other groups like that, being known as the White Russians, sort of white versus red. And the other powers, the Americans, the Japanese, the British, the French, are actually sending weapons and material and money and even soldiers to assist the White Russians against the communists. So 1919, 1920, you actually have American troops landing in Siberia, marching in there. They never really fight any major battles, but they're kind of seizing control of the rail lines and feeding, money and supplies through to White Russian armies. So you really start off with a very hostile situation, heavy conflict between the communist Soviet Union and the rest of the world. The communists do, in spite of all this, wind up winning the Civil War and consolidating their control. But you do wind up with a very dictatorial kind of a state eventually, because you get this sort of fear of invasion from the outside and all the outside powers intruding there. So communist regime, that's going to be a major deal. The next crack is going to be Germany, which pretty much is what winds up ending the war. When you get to 1918, the Germans launch one final offensive to try to win the war. It fails, and at that point, morale collapses back in Germany. You get uprisings, you get mutinies on the part of troops. Starts in the Navy Yards, where some sailors are told to go out on what would have been a suicide mission against the British Navy. They refuse, mutiny, and that kind of kicks off a series of revolts in Germany that forces the Kaiser, the German monarch, to flee the country. The German government collapses and they have to sign a peace treaty and develop a new government. So that's World War I, sort of, really changing a lot of things. You're going to have a communist power. And then the final thing is in the aftermath of World War I, what happens next? The war had devastated societies. It had devastated economies of the winners as well as the losers. You get widespread economic depression. You've got depopulation. You've got demoralization as people are sort of questioning, why did our governments lead us into this incredibly destructive war in the first place? And so you have a lot of instability going on in various countries. Obviously, the whole civil war is going on in the Soviet Union, and you get, in a sense, a couple of decades of what's been called a European civil war going on country by country elsewhere, too. You get communist movements in Germany trying to reshape the new Germany after the Kaiser along Soviet lines, and the Soviet Union is very much promoting this and supporting these groups. For a while, you actually get a Munich Soviet in the city of Munich in southern Germany, in Bavaria, about 1920 or so. In Italy, you get similar kinds of things. Italy had been on the winning side, but had had a lot of people killed and not too much to show for it coming out of the Versailles Treaty, widespread disaffection with the government, and so communist movements there also trying to take advantage of the disruption and change Italy into their image. And these communist movements in various European nations wind up giving rise to anti-communist movements that are not wanting to see their countries go in a communist direction, react in the other direction. It's kind of far-right groups. So, for example, in Germany, you get groups called the Freikorps, who are basically veterans of the war, guys who were out of the army, who sort of took their guns with them when they left, and who are now kind of banding together in these, local illegal militia groups in order to fight the communists on the street or out in the fields. And you get these actual, street fights going on and, firefights and people raiding villages and killing off supporters of each other out in the countryside, killing off supporters of each other's sides, communists versus Freikorps, this kind of thing. Similar things going on in Italy, where the anti-communists come together as the fascists under Mussolini, take charge of the government. They're one of the first groups to really sort of establish one of these new right-wing nationalistic governments, and all kind of in an anti-communist sort of a vein. So this is going on not just in Russia, but is going on in really lots of different countries around Europe. Spain's going to have its own civil war that's going to happen in the 30s. Yeah, so this is sort of hopefully helpful to you, setting up some of the ideologies, their long-term background and nationalism. The new movements like the fascists in Italy, like the Nazis that will arise in connection with the Freikorps and the anti-communist movement more broadly in Germany, really being kind of hyper-nationalistic, right? That's kind of the key way to think about them. They have an ideology which not only says sort of the focus of political loyalty and the source of political legitimacy ought to be coming out of the nation, but they're totalitarian, which means that loyalty to the nation needs to trump everything else, right? Family, religion, class, your socioeconomic class, your fellow workers or whatever, all those other loyalties need to take second place and need to serve the needs of the nation, right? Nation above all, nation is the first loyalty, and everything else is only acceptable insofar as it goes with your loyalty to your nation. And the other thing, which is a component of the right-wing ideologies, like Nazism and fascism, is the idea that the nation's will, the nation's leadership is going to arise in a single individual. It's kind of a romantic idea of the spirit of the nation, and these movements have this idea that one charismatic individual can have this sort of unique spirit in them, which makes them the embodiment of the nation, right? They're not a king, it's not a hereditary thing handed down to them, it's not, coming down by blood or ancestry, it's more they're sort of a man of the people, a representative of the people. And you get this initially with Mussolini in Italy, Il Duce in Italian, which just means the leader. And Mussolini promotes this, what we call a cult of personality, an idea that he's not the king of Italy, he's not a descendant of a monarchy, but he is the embodiment of the Italian spirit. He's what Italy is all about, and he's therefore justified in being the exclusive focus of loyalty, the exclusive decision maker, the person who's the right one to have as your leader, and therefore as a dictator. Hitler eventually rising to power and becoming the same, perceived in the same way in Germany, right? Der Führer, the leader, the person who is going to be the sole leader, the embodiment of the German spirit, and therefore who is entitled to take dictatorial type of powers. Okay, so that's ideological background. Hopefully that's helpful. Sorry I'm getting this to you late in the week. If you get to see this before you compose your comments tonight, or if you want to incorporate some of it over the weekend, feel free, but just do take these into account, sort of thinking about the setup for World War II and ideologically how it's affecting things. Thank you very much.